Thank you very much for having me. It's an honor to be here. And I want to just apologize in advance because of the time change of the hearing. I'll have to leave at 1:20 because I have another meeting that I couldn't move, but happy to take any questions or follow-ups that people have via email or any other method. What I would like to do is share some of the ways that the operation of criminal law enforcement and punishment discriminates against Black people in America. And I'm not going to cover it all in the time that I have, but I'm going to give you an overview. And I know that you have other witnesses who are going to cover other aspects of how bias in housing and transportation, education, and the like exist, and they intersect with criminal law because they do help explain why a disproportionate number of people of color are committing crimes relative to their proportions in the population. So when you see statistics that might show homicides or robberies are being disproportionately committed by Black people, there are these structural biases that put them at a disadvantage in terms of other opportunities that help account for that. And so you can imagine if you don't have jobs or educational opportunities, turning to criminal behaviors is sometimes the only option. And I'm not going to focus on those. What I want to focus on for you today is the widespread evidence of bias within the administration of criminal law itself. So we have these other forms of bias that may lead people to commit crimes, but I want to show you the ways in which how we enforce criminal law has biases against people of color. So if we could go two more slides forward to set the stage. Thank you. What I'm going to do is just first give you a quick kind of bird's eye view that the United States incarcerates way more people than any other country in the world by orders of magnitude. Next slide. You're going to see how those people are allocated mostly in state prisons. It's about 2 million people that are incarcerated, but some in local jails, and most of those are there pre-trial. And then if you look at the next slide, you're going to see that that's really the tip of the iceberg, because we have millions more people who find themselves under a system of correctional control with parole, probation, and other forms of supervision. At the next slide, will give you an indication of what drives this, which is mostly state decisions. This is not the federal government. It's mostly states making decisions to use incarceration this way. And that is true of California, which is the second largest number of people in prison in the United States are in California. So it has been a leader in terms of total number of people. And then if you look at the slide after this one, you will see that it's a disproportionately large number of people who are incarcerated are people of color. So this is the overall number, 60% in America. In California, it's even worse. More than 72% of the people who are incarcerated in California are Black or Hispanic. And we see similar dynamics in terms of disparities for people under criminal justice supervision. Just a huge proportion of them are people of color. Now, as I said that at the outset, some of this is because we have a disproportionate number of people of color committing crimes, again, because of a variety of structural disadvantages. But what I want to show you now is the way in which this large number of people who are incarcerated or under criminal justice supervision, the way in which that is because of the way criminal law operates and disproportionately targets them. So if we go to the next slide, I'm going to begin by talking to you a little bit about policing. And I'm only going to just give you a select sampling of studies. There are tons, but this will give you an idea. So the next slide shows you what we see in terms of traffic stops. So the police are not pulling everyone in America over at equal rates. Instead, they are disproportionately pulling over Black drivers as opposed to white drivers. And there's a really interesting study that shows that these differences dissipate as it gets darker during the daytime, when we get towards dusk and evening, when police officers cannot see the skin color of the driver, these differences start to go away. So the darker the sky, the less pronounced the disparity, which is to say, or put it a different way, is when police officers can see the color of the skin of the driver, they are disproportionately pulling over people who are Black. The next slide will show you that the people who are pulled over, so they're disproportionately Black people in the first instance, And we also know that they're more likely to be searched when they're pulled over. And interestingly, and this, by the way, is from an LAPD study in particular, when they are searched, when drivers are searched, the black drivers are far less likely to actually have contraband on them. So they're being pulled over at higher rates, but when they are pulled over, they're less likely to have done anything wrong. So you can see that basically the police aren't pulling them over because they're actually engaged in wrongful behaviors, which is evidenced by the fact that they don't actually have anything on them when they're being pulled over. The next slide gives you a meta-analysis of 20 million traffic stops and what we've learned from them across the country. So what we learn is black people are almost twice as likely to be pulled over as white people. They're more likely to be searched after they've been stopped. And so just by getting in a car, a black driver has twice the odds of being pulled over, 4 times the odds of being searched. And when they are searched, they're less likely to have any kind of contraband. So another way you could put this one is to say that when fewer white people are being stopped, and when they are, they're less likely to be searched. And yet when they are searched, the white people are more likely to have contraband. The next slide will show you that the black people who are stopped are often, it's not explicable in terms of them having done anything wrong. Studies have tried to figure out, can you understand this in terms of gang affiliation, prior arrest records, crime rates, any of those things? Is that's what explaining why we're seeing a disproportionately large number of people being stopped who are black? And when studies have sought to look into all of those things, they find none of them explain it. That in fact, it looks like the only thing that's left over to explain these stops is merely race. That is why people are being pulled over. If you look at the next slide, you'll see that police officers are often pulling black drivers over for pretextual reasons, saying things like they had mechanical issues, there was an equipment problem with their car, whereas when white drivers are being pulled over, it's usually for much more serious things, more serious driving violations, things like speeding. So again, just giving you a sense of what law enforcement officers are doing when they're exercising their discretion to pull drivers over. The next slide just gives you more detail on the reasons given for these kinds of stops. And now the next slide after this one, although I know California is much more of a driving state than a pedestrian state, this is just to show you that we see the same dynamic when officers are stopping people who are walking for pedestrians. So this data comes from Jacksonville, but it's indicative of data nationwide. Again, you're just far more likely to be stopped if you are a black person, and the rates are much higher. So I think it's important to think about how much discretion police officers have in deciding who it is they're going to have interactions with and who they're going to stop. This isn't like situations where there's an identifiable crime with a victim. These are crimes where there's just way more people than could ever be addressed, stopped. So the police are making choices, and the way they're making those choices is to target black people without any link to crime or misbehavior. It's just using the discretion to do that. The next slide will show you that we see a similar pattern in terms of arrest rates for various kinds of low-level crimes that, again, police have choices. We see lots of people loitering, people who could potentially be charged for trespass, but they're using their discretion to target these kinds of arrests to communities of color. The next slide will show you this is also true when it comes to drug offenses. So we know that drug use and drug trafficking, those are comparable by race, that pretty much we're seeing people, white people, black people, they are using and selling in proportion to their percentages in the population. But drug arrests are disproportionately targeted against black people, even though the usage rates for white people and black people are the same and the sales rates are the same. The police are using their discretion to disproportionately target people who are black. The next slide will show you this starkly with marijuana. Again, the use rates are comparable, but it's black people who are getting arrested for possessing pot, not white people. And then the next slide will show you that this bias isn't just about these questions of who gets stopped and who gets arrested. We also see bias in police use of force and the kind of force that's used in police interactions, where it's disproportionately used against people of color, and in particular, as you see here, against Black people. The next slide will show you that the police are more than twice as likely to use force against people of color. And remember, they're stopping more people of color in the first place. And so you're twice as likely to then use force in these interactions. The next slide is sadly the most extreme use of force, resulting in the police killing somebody. And again, you are far more likely to be killed by the police if you are a Black person in America. So the slide after this one will explain that this is not because Black people are more likely to be armed than white people. So if we're trying to understand why are these police use of force interactions taking place, it's not because of a differential in terms of Black people versus white people being armed. If you're a Black person and you're unarmed, you are 3.5 times more likely to be shot by the police than if you're a white person who is unarmed. And what we find when we study this is that what seems to be explaining it is that we see large instances of inequality in the communities where Black people are suffering this kind of police use of force. So it's not tied to the use of force by the person who has it used against them by the police. So the next slide is to just explain the horrible tragedy of all this, is that we're seeing all this excessive policing, all this policing that is disproportionately targeting Black people and communities of color, and it's doing a terrible job at actually solving serious crimes. And it's particularly bad, the police are particularly bad at solving crimes with Black victims. So another way in which criminal law enforcement discriminates is by solving fewer cases that involve Black victims. And I should say that I think one reason why this happens is because there is not as much cooperation in those cases, precisely because communities of color have such a distrust of the police because of all those biased stops and the use of force against them. It really creates a vicious circle with a lot of distrust, lack of cooperation, and therefore more ineffective policing in solving these cases with Black victims. So I could occupy tons of time on this. I know I've gone super quickly, but I hope this gives you at least an indication of that kind of bias. The next slide is going to introduce you to other forms of bias in the system, and I'd like to start just by talking about what happens in prosecution. So the next slide will just tell you about those people that I mentioned who are detained before their trial. They haven't been found convicted of anything. It's about 500,000 people who find themselves in this situation. You are way more likely to get detained pretrial in America if you are Black than if you are white, and it has nothing to do with the crimes that you were charged with. If you hold all that constant, you look at the crimes charged, what you find is just Black people are getting detained more pretrial. Their bail amounts, where there is bail, are set at much higher rates than white people, again, controlling for everything you control. We look at the type of crime, criminal record, and there's still this inexplicable difference that looks to be based on nothing other than race. The next slide shows you that we see the same bias in charging decisions, where if you're a white defendant, you're far more likely to have a serious charge dismissed against you than a Black defendant. And again, that's all controlling for the kind of crime you committed and your previous record. And if it's a misdemeanor kind of a case, a less serious one, if you're a white defendant, you're 75% more likely than a Black defendant to have those charges dismissed or reduced. Again, the next slide will show you that when you are a white defendant, you're offered better deals than Black defendants. So I previously mentioned those dismissals, but it's also true that if you are a Black defendant, you're more likely to get prison time, whereas white defendants are more likely to be offered things like community service and fines. The next slide will show you that we see the same kind of bias in terms of who gets charged with mandatory minimums, habitual offender laws like California's 3 strikes laws. You're far more likely to be charged with those if you're a Black defendant than if you are a white defendant. And I will tell you, in California, that's true of 3 strikes decisions as well. There's a study by Elsa Chen that found racial disparities in 3 strike sentences, and she finds they're greatest in cases of property and drug crimes as opposed to violent crimes, and that if you're an African American defendant, you're significantly more likely to get a 3rd strike sentence. So again, this kind of bias exists with all kinds of charging, including these sorts of laws. And then the next slide will show you that this happens at sentencing as well. The next slide is an example from the federal system where you can see that people who are Black are getting sentences 19% longer than people who are white, controlling again for type of crime and criminal background. And the next slide shows you from a study in Georgia that same kind of variation. And here, what's even more disturbing is that it varied based on the shade of somebody's skin. So the darker skinned Black people got sentences even longer than medium skinned Black people, and then as compared to lighter skinned Black people. So the sentence got increasingly longer the darker your skin tone, with all Black people getting sentences significantly longer than people who are white. Again, controlling for everything else. It's just a question of the color of somebody's skin. In the next slide, I can show you that we see this kind of disparity when it comes to the treatment of people who are kids, juveniles. If you're Black, you're far more likely to get transferred to adult court or to be suspended. The next slide will show you that we see the same kind of discrimination when we're talking about whether people get their parole revoked. People who are Black get their parole revoked at much higher rates. And again, these are usually discretionary decisions that an official will have. And just like we saw with the police and we saw with prosecutors and judges at sentencing, these parole officials are exercising their discretion in ways that are disproportionately negatively affecting Black people. Next slide will show you that by now you can probably anticipate that we see the same bias when we're talking about parole and clemency, where you're just far more likely to get it if you're white than if you're Black. And then finally, I will just add in the next slide that your treatment while you're incarcerated is worse if you're Black than white. You're more likely, for example, to be held in solitary confinement. So it's everywhere you look in the administration of criminal law and punishment. It's stopping by the police. It's what you're arrested for. It's what you're charged with. It's whether your charges get dismissed. It's the plea that you're offered. It's the sentence you're given. It's whether your parole is revoked. We have study after study after study, and they're validated, excellent, peer-reviewed studies that are all replicating these same findings. And it doesn't end there, because even after you have been through this process and you've been convicted and you've served your sentence, you're going to have collateral consequences that affect your life. You're going to be denied housing opportunities, both public and private, with landlord restrictions on people with convictions, denied licenses, drivers and occupational. It snowballs so that all these discriminatory decisions end up having this disproportionate effect through someone's entire lifetime, even after they've served their sentence. So that's the overview that I wanted to give you, just to give you a hint of the kind of evidence that's out there on bias in the criminal legal system in America and in California in particular. And I will stay till 1:20 and answer questions if you have them by then. And if not, please reach out. I'd be happy to help you in any way that I can.